Greetings, comrades! You know, about a year ago there was a viral TikTok test. Yes, we are now starting our historical videos with TikTok tests. So in it you had to ask your partner who they'd like to be, a cowboy, a samurai or a pirate. Those are all appealing historical archetypes embodying certain personality ideals, freedom, loyalty, a thirst for adventure and so on. But if we ran these tests using Russian history, the answer for most men would be simple. I'd like to be a free Cossack. The fact is that Cossacks embody virtually all of these ideals. Freedom like cowboys, honor like samurai, adventure and rebellion like pirates. They are probably the most idealized, most romanticized, and the most mythologized group of people in Russian history. People sometimes almost deify them. Yet modern scholars still debate what exactly they did, how isolated they were from other social groups, and most importantly, who they were and where they even came from. Well, let's try to figure it out. What do Borsch, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, and the Cossacks have in common? That's right, billions of pages of online arguments about whether to consider all of these Russian or Ukrainian. Today, the Cossacks are an important symbol of Ukrainian nationalism and are often portrayed as the ethnic progenitors of the Ukrainian nation. The Cossack hetmanate is considered the predecessor of the Ukrainian state, even in the Western press. And all Ukrainians are supposedly descendants of the proud and independent Cossacks. But for some reason the Cossacks served the Russian Tsar, conquering the Urals and Siberia for him. There was a Yakutsk City Cossack regiment, and during the Civil War the Cossacks formed not the Zaporozhian or Kiev Cossack state, but the Orenburg Cossack Republic. And why are Cossacks considered the forefathers of Ukraine and not Kazakhstan? Kazakh and Cossack are literally the same Turkic word. Could you have been lied to, and could the Cossacks have nothing to do with Ukraine? Or did Ukrainians conquer Siberia for the Russian Tsar? Or are these Cossacks completely different, as the English Wikipedia tells us? Of course not. It's just that, as I said, there are a huge number of myths and legends surrounding the Cossacks, and issues relating to their way of life, customs, history and origins are often exploited for political purposes. Even historians don't have a unified view on the matter. Never mind the historians, even in Russian linguistics there is no consensus on the correct pronunciation – Kazaki or Kazaki. In fact, let's start with linguistics because the origin of the Russian word for Cossacks is clear. It comes from a Turkic word meaning free, independent person, adventurer or vagabond. Now you see why I started with pirates and cowboys, right? Originally, the word referred to someone who had separated from their state, community or clan, alone with their family, and was forced to seek a livelihood in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. But does that mean all Cossacks were runaway adventurers? No. This brings us to the first question, the question of self-identification. Are the Cossacks a social class or an ethnic group? According to the laws of the Russian Empire, the answer is simple. The Cossacks were a special military class with compulsory service. In other words, they were simply a distinct branch of the military. There were merchants who traded, clergy who served God, and Cossacks who served the Tsar and guarded the empire's borders. There is also the other extreme, viewing the Cossacks as a distinct ethnic group, an independent people, a fourth branch of the Eastern Slavs, or even a unique nation of mixed Turkic-Slavic origin. However, we should not adopt such radical viewpoints. The Cossacks are somewhere between a sub-ethnic group and a specific socio-cultural group. Due to their unique way of life, autonomy and geographical isolation from other social classes, the Cossacks developed characteristics that distinguish them as a separate group. Over time, they could have become a distinct ethnic group, if not for the revolution and civil war. The second important question is, where did the Cossacks come from? The first theory is the one officially accepted in the USSR. Cossack communities formed as a result of Russian peasants fleeing serfdom sometime around the 16th century. In other words, the Cossacks were Russians or Ukrainians who fled from the Tsar and the boyars to the wild field, the steppe, and established their own unique frontier way of life there. The second view regards the Cossacks as a people who lived on these lands for hundreds of years, possibly as far back as antiquity, formed through the mixing of numerous Turanian, Scythian and other tribes. All other theories fall somewhere between these two, along with fringe ideas like Cossacks being Christianized Polovtsians or Russians who lived on the Golden Horde territories. The problem is, no single theory is 100% confirmed by serious historical documents. Therefore, we can cautiously assume that representatives of a wide variety of ethnic groups, both Turkic and Slavic, were involved in the formation of the Cossacks. They lived in the Great Steppe region or migrated there in search of a better life. However, it is most likely they were predominantly Slavic. The land was fertile but dangerous. They found themselves in a state of constant military conflict with hostile and warlike nomadic neighbors, which forced the local inhabitants to defend themselves somehow. And not only to defend themselves, these free people were themselves quite active in raiding and plundering. After all, as the saying goes, there is no extradition from the dawn. Gradually, under these harsh conditions, fairly large militarized communities were formed, which later gave rise to the Cossacks that everyone knows. The third unresolved question is, were the Cossacks truly a free people who lived by democratic principles for centuries, or were they loyal and devoted servants of one sovereign? Neither. Since the Cossacks originally settled in the borderlands between the Crimean Khanate, Lithuania, Poland and the Muscovite Tsardom, they found themselves in a unique situation. No single ruler's authority was strong enough to fully subjugate them, yet all were significant enough that they could not exist completely independently. Again, there is, for example, a conventional distinction between free and enlisted Cossacks. Thus, among Ukrainian Cossacks, the free Cossacks include those from the Zaporozhian Sich, which existed until 1775, while the enlisted Cossacks include the registered Cossacks who received an official salary for serving the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the reign of King Zygmunt. But in reality, these were not two different types of people. It's just that over time, one of the defining traits of the Cossacks, freedom, that is, independence, transformed into service to whichever state could pay the most. Depending on the reward, Cossacks served Crimean Khans, Ottomans, Swedes and the Russian Tsar. They helped Ivan the Terrible conquer Kazan, but half a century later marched against Moscow alongside the Poles. Historically, you could find Cossacks fighting for the Persian Shah, the Japanese Imperial Army, or even in a war between Paraguay and Bolivia. But let's return to the 16th-17th centuries and the final main question. Which Cossacks are the real ones, the Russians or the Ukrainians? One need only glance at a map to realize that there was never any iron curtain or stone wall between Zaporozhye and the Don. These two were very similar groups with very similar ways of life, although there were of course some differences. There was a constant exchange of people between them, and the Cossacks did not identify themselves as representatives of one particular nation in the modern sense. They identified themselves as Orthodox Christians, but also willingly accepted anyone who could handle a weapon. Later on, the Cossacks welcomed Tatars, Buryats, Yakuts, Ossetians, Turks, you name it. Want to fight? Good for you. Learn to cross yourself while doing it? God bless you. Well, and then you know the rest. The states surrounding the Great Steppe grew ever stronger, and it became increasingly difficult for the Cossacks to remain truly free. All these communities faced a choice: which sovereign to serve. Even the hero of Zaporozhye, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, having risen up against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, quickly realized that an independent hetmanate was doomed. He had to choose one of the four rulers: the Turkish Sultan, the Crimean Khan, the Polish King, or the Tsar of Moscow, and submit to his authority. Sooner or later, all Cossack communities faced the same choice, and in the end, most of them ended up in the service of the Russian Tsardom, and later the Russian Empire. For many reasons, from the Orthodox faith and cultural affinity to generous pay. There, they did what they did best: they fought. In fact, it was Cossack detachment that conquered virtually all of Siberia for the Russian Tsardom. It was the Russian version of the conquest of the Wild West. A single ataman Yermak with a handful of armed Cossacks presented the Tsar with lands the size of all of Europe, although they also had peaceful expeditions. For instance, in 1618, Ivan Petlin, a Siberian Cossack from Tomsk, led the first Russian mission to reach Beijing and secure permission to trade with China for the first time. So, how did the life of the Cossacks differ from that of other people in the Russian state? War played a huge role in it. At the same time, however, their communities had an elected system of government and were governed by relatively democratic principles. Major decisions were made at general Cossack assemblies, known as Kruks or Radas, which served as the Cossacks' highest governing bodies. Executive power belonged to the ataman, who was elected and replaced at these assemblies, and who was unquestionably obeyed. The Cossacks' most important livelihood came from the spoils of war, obtained from campaigns mainly to Crimea, Turkey, Persia and the Caucasus, places where their fellow believers did not live. At first, it was actually beneficial for Moscow to distance itself from the independent Cossack communities. For example, Moscow could tell the Turks that the Cossacks were not under their command, and were therefore free to plunder their lands. Meanwhile, the Tsar could claim innocence. The Cossacks themselves were free to behave as brazenly as they pleased. You've surely seen the famous painting The Zaporozhian Cossacks Write a Letter to the Turkish Sultan, where a ragged crowd sends a powerful ruler a string of choice curses, calling him a shaitan, a swineherd and a pig all at once. At the same time, they had an obvious social contract with the state. In exchange for land, a Tsarist stipend and a tax exemption, the Russian authorities required the Cossacks to perform military service and defend the borders against raids by the steppe hordes, serve as a buffer for central Russian lands. To cement loyalty to the Moscow throne, by the end of the 17th century, the Tsars had succeeded in securing an oath of allegiance from all Cossack hosts. The last to swear allegiance in 1671 was the Don Cossack host. As a result, the Cossacks transformed from voluntary allies into full-fledged subjects of the Russian Tsar. At the same time, the Cossacks' free spirit did not just disappear. The leaders of the two largest uprisings in the history of Tsarist Russia, Stepan Razin and Emelian Pugachev, were Cossacks and relied on Cossack troops. For this, insurgent Cossack settlements were regularly subjected to brutal punishments, up to and including complete destruction by the Tsarist troops, often assembled from the same Cossacks, only slightly more loyal. One way or another, over the years, the Cossacks gradually lost many of their democratic rights and achievements. In 1721, Peter I abolished the election of atamans. They were now appointed by the Tsar, so any pretense of equality and democracy ended. The Cossacks lost the last remnants of their independence after the defeat of the Pugachev rebellion in 1775, when Catherine the Great dissolved the Zaporozhian Sich. Thereafter, Cossack troops were formed primarily through centralized recruitment, and in those areas where there was a need for them. By the end of the 19th century, there were 11 Cossack hosts and 2 separate Cossack battalions in Russia. So, over the course of 300 years, the free Cossack people evolved into a class completely subservient to the authorities and became the emperor's greatest weapon. They traded complete freedom for a steady salary and quite a few privileges. A Cossack is born to be of service to the Tsar, went an old Cossack saying. Can you imagine free Cossacks saying something like that? The Caucasus, Siberia, Central Asia, the Far East, all of these regions were explored and conquered by the Cossack armies. Cossacks served from the age of 18 for a period of 20 years. Each man reported for duty with his own uniform, cold weapons and riding horse. Until the 19th century, their appearance, though, was not officially regulated anywhere. It was not until 1816 that a decree was issued detailing their clothing and armament, and even then these varied by region. Traditional men's clothing consisted of a shirt and loose-fitting trousers. Much was borrowed from neighboring peoples. For example, the Burka, Bashlyk, Cherkeska and Bishmet, typical of the Terik, Kuban and Don Cossacks, were adopted virtually unchanged from the peoples of the Caucasus. The Ural Cossacks wore the Chekmen and Malachai, which in their cut resembled similar Tatar, Bashkir or Nagai garments. Women's clothing also differed significantly from that of the rest of Russia. Instead of the tunic-like shirt characteristic of Russian women's attire, they wore skirts with blouses, and the embroidery and headwear styles were distinct. Of course, weapons held a special place. Until 1881, the saber was the primary weapon of the Cossacks. Later, it was replaced by the shashka, which was presented to a Cossack on his 17th birthday. A straight or curved dagger was often added. It was also not uncommon to see a nagaika hanging from the leg of a Cossack's boot, a short whip made of leather straps with a wooden handle. Although the Cossacks are primarily associated with warfare, their lives eventually became more peaceful. Cossack settlements began to resemble full-fledged towns, and the Cossacks started to form families and have children. Eventually, they even divided into social classes: farmers, civil servants, merchants and the clergy. By the way, regarding families, where did the Cossacks even get them, given that they were originally fierce warriors, loners who had chosen this path? Indeed, in the early stages, for example in the Zaporozhian Sich, family life was rejected outright. The Cossack population grew solely through recruitment. Later, they began taking women captive during raids on neighboring territories, primarily from Turkish or Tatar lands. To marry, a prospective husband simply had to bring his chosen one to a public gathering, declare her his wife, and that was it. Later, thanks to the constant influx of new people, the Cossacks' attitude towards family life began to change, and the more traditional family life and lifestyle took shape. Several generations lived together in a single family, numbering up to 25 to 30 people, and a strict patriarchy reigned within it. The head of the family was its absolute master, assigning and supervising the work of every family member and managing the household budget. Cossack settlements were usually called stanitsas. Incidentally, they have not disappeared. According to the latest Russian census, there are about 440 stanitsas in our country today. They occupy a rather unique position. You see, in Russia, settlements are divided into urban, город, cities and towns, and rural, sela and деревни, different types of villages. Stanitsas are formally classified as rural settlements, but the largest stanitsa, Kanevskaya in Krasnodar Krai, is home to about 40,000 people, more than in many towns. By the end of the Russian Empire, the total Cossack population was estimated at approximately 4.4 million people. And like a true warrior caste, it was war that ultimately destroyed them. In the civil war, they chose the wrong side and lost. Although the traditional view that all Cossacks supported the whites does not quite reflect reality. Yes, they were undoubtedly a backbone of the white movement. But many still believe that the famous Red commander Semyon Budyonny was also a Cossack, but he wasn't. However, his example clearly illustrates the class issue within the Cossacks, which ultimately led to their downfall. You see, Semyon Budyonny was born on a farmstead in Kozyurin, Kalmyk district, Don Host region. He had been skilled with horses and weapons since childhood, and at the age of 20 was drafted into the Russian Imperial Army's 26th Don Cossack Regiment. A true Cossack. But Semyon's father, Mikhail Ivanovich, was, though also a local, a non-resident peasant, Inagorodets. Among the Don Cossacks in the 19th century, this term referred to people who had come to settle on their lands from other regions. They were permitted to live in Cossack territories, but the true Cossacks often treated them as second-class citizens. For example, they were not allowed to participate in assemblies or make decisions regarding local social and economic affairs. Only their descendants had a chance to become true Cossacks, but only after a couple of generations of loyal military service to the Tsar. Thus, formally speaking, Budyonny himself could not be considered a Cossack. At the same time, the number of those non-residents was constantly growing. By 1917, they made up half the population of the Don and Kuban regions. The rift between them and the Cossacks widened. The Cossack elite rejected the newcomers, blaming them for their own impoverishment, while the newcomers did not understand why the Cossacks were entitled to special treatment, or why they alone owned all the land. As a result, when the civil war broke out, the real Cossacks sided with the whites, fighting for the faith, the Tzar, the motherland and tradition. And almost all of the non-residents sided with the Reds, who promised to take the land from the Cossacks and divide it fairly. Moreover, the local peasantry had reasons to hate the Cossacks. Remember that by the 20th century they had completely transformed from free-spirited rebels into the autocracy's watchdogs, dispersing protests with whips. So the civil war in the Don and Kuban regions was not fought between the Cossacks and the Bolsheviks, who were practically non-existent in rural areas, but between the Cossacks and the Inogorodцы. However, this was not the case everywhere. For example, in Ukraine, two organizations called the Free Cossacks and the Red Cossacks fought each other, each regarding themselves as the true Cossacks and their opponents as impostors. And the majority never even took up arms. In the end, the Cossacks found themselves internally divided, massacred en masse in the fires of the Red and White terrors. Some went into exile, while others remained on their lands but were brutally de-Cossacized by the Soviet authorities. Again, no one knows exactly how many Cossacks actually fell victim to the terror of the Soviet regime. Estimates range from thousands to a million. Then came the dekulakization, which undoubtedly affected the Cossacks as well. Nevertheless, in 1936, the Cossacks were once again permitted to serve in the Red Army. Some cavalry divisions were designated as Cossack units, and they were even given back their historic uniforms. During World War II, the Cossacks played an active role in defending their homeland. Not only defending, though. On the very first day Germany launched military operations against the USSR, Pyotr Nikolaevich Krasnov, the Cossack ataman of the Great Don Cossack host who was in exile, addressed the Cossacks with a proclamation, "May God help the German arms and Hitler." For this, he was arrested by the British in 1945 and, along with 2,400 Cossack officers, handed over to the Soviet government and subsequently executed. Incidentally, Hitler had his own theory about the origins of the Cossacks. Allegedly, they were descendants of the Gauls, and thus belonged to the Aryan race. He managed to win over between 70 and 110,000 Cossacks to his side, but they found no retribution for their defeat in the civil war. That said, returning to the remarkable duality of the Cossacks' nature and perception, one might think that, as enemies in the Civil War and the World War II, they certainly should not have been romanticized in the Soviet era. But if we look at iconic Soviet films, The Silent Dawn, The Kuban Cossacks, The Officers, the charismatic main characters portrayed Cossacks and became idols to millions of young Soviet boys who dreamed of riding horses and wielding Cossack sabers. And these boys didn't really care which Cossacks were on the right or red side of history and which weren't. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, various movements aimed at reviving traditions gained significant momentum. Descendants of pre-revolutionary Cossacks, or those who identify as such, attempted to revive the Cossack movement in Russia, a caste of warriors and defenders. And now, in the Kubanian throughout Russia, you'll encounter people in Cossack uniforms gathering for their assemblies and attempting to revive their culture. Millions of rubles are allocated from the budget to various Cossack NGOs, and the authorities sometimes have even enlisted Cossacks to help maintain order on the streets. But the public's attitude toward modern Cossacks is, to put it mildly, mixed. The contrast is particularly amusing. In Ukraine, a Cossack is a symbol of freedom, independence and national identity. In Russia, however, according to officials in 2021, nearly 70% of social media posts about the Cossacks in the Russian Federation were negative. At best, they'll be called a reenactment club that performs bizarre pseudo-historical rituals using our tax money. At worst, they'll be called a bunch of dressed-up clowns with BDSM tendencies. This phenomenon was particularly evident in the 2010s, when the internet was literally flooded with news about the exploits of representatives of the modern Cossacks. Here are just two typical news stories from those years. In 2013, at the Anapa airport, Cossacks tried to strangle the basis of the American rock band Bloodhound Gang with the US flag. And after the mass murder of 20 people by bandits in the Kuban stanitsa of Kushevskaya, the Ataman of the Cossack army quickly declared that the Cossacks knew nothing about the rampant crime, and even if they had known, they have no authority to detain criminals. What a pity. Are the priorities of those who today call themselves the Cossack army and defenders of the motherland correct? Are they not, through their actions and inactions, turning the image of a proud historical warrior into a caricature wielding a whip? An utterly useless figure. However, that is a completely different story. Thanks for watching, and as always, a huge shoutout to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Petar, Ilic, Marina Ilyanova, Jonathan Schilze, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous. See you guys next time.